No problem. Fortunately, I'm going to be in here in the next hour as well, so now we got it connected, we're all set. But the idea with this was basically Minnesota tech stack, and everybody knows something about who's using what software. Nobody knows everything, is sort of the idea. And by the way, I'm Craig Fisk. I'm the organizer of this session, but in classic bar camp style, I don't know anything either. I just thought it was a good idea to have this kind of session, and especially for people that are looking for a job, et cetera. If you're currently learning Go or Python or JavaScript or whatever, you probably want to know where are the companies that actually are using that. So I tried to break this out into two different sections. Let's see if I can actually come up with the right thing here. Hold on a second. Okay. So we have the companies that are doing stuff on the top, and then I put down below a section on who's using what technology. Oops, wrong page. Where is that? Oh, let's see. Okay, try this again. Okay, so, oh, now we have nothing at all. I gotta look at the screen. Okay, so we're off the screen, and Minnesota tech stack, here we go. I gotta open this up, and then, there we go. So we have, what companies are using what. So like 3M, I know there's a bunch of old AS400s there, but that's about all I know. It's been a long time since I did anything there. Does anybody know what's going on at 3M? What software they're using? What programming environments or whatever?
Asking here?
What's that?
You're asking the question of what they write programs in?
Yeah. What are they? Well, there's really two areas in this that I thought about. One is the programming language, and database environment, cloud, what cloud to a certain extent, because there's GCP versus AWS or Azure, stuff like that. People tend to get sort of religious about this within companies, like, we learn one stack, we don't want to have to deal with anything else. So there are some of these that, like Svelte, I went on Indeed.com and I just took a look at what were the jobs that were available in Minneapolis, St. Paul for various things. And Svelte is relatively new, so there were only two that came up. And who knows, there might only be one person doing anything with Svelte at Accenture. Nobody even knows what it is, but it's if you're familiar with React and JavaScript front ends, then React evolved to be Vue, which is what we're working with, and that's kind of evolved to be Svelte, which is the current generation thing, but it's much more isolated in terms of who's using it. But Best Buy, anybody here work at Best Buy or know what kind of programming environment's being used?
I just want to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I want to disclaim to people to not disclose things at these companies or to their clients.
Okay.
You can't give away certain internal information about apps and codes. Everyone here should know that. So don't try to bait people into giving that away. I don't think that's appropriate.
Well, you can do it in terms of what's listed on Indeed or ZipRecruiter or whatever.
You can talk about publicly known stuff, but don't try to bait people
Sure.
into getting inside information about what tools they're using, what code they're
Yeah.
using.
Yeah, we don't want any insider information.
Could be abused by salespeople.
Yeah, it could be abused by salespeople.
Or
So what's your goal with this? What are you trying, knowing this, what are you trying to do?
The goal is really to know what companies to take a look at and apply to. If you're working in a particular technology area. Actually, I've only been here for like 7 months, and I found it to be sort of inscrutable in the Bay Area. Everybody. I was in San Jose. Everybody knows what's being used at particular companies. Here, there's some older environments like Cargill and 3M and so on that have been around for a while, but they're also doing some innovative new stuff. And just knowing what the tech stack is would be kind of useful. When you get into any bigger company, the answer to the question really ends up being everything. There's some part of the company that's probably using everything.
Copy everything on your list, and 3M is using it, and then add some more.
Yeah.
A bunch of homegrown stuff.
Oh, yeah. And this is mostly bigger companies too, but not entirely. It's also a few that I run into. So anybody want to add anything to this?
Well, I think Best Buy uses React. I talked to someone earlier, and I think it's really good to show what the actual tech stack is in a company on a job posting, right? Because developers are interested in specific stacks. So I don't think
their hiring page for developers might very well say that. Cargill, you can write SAP.
SAP, okay.
$3 billion.
Can't get in it.
So it's probably not a big secret.
You know, there's a small issue here in that I can't both see the screen and put it up there at the same time. So I'm going to have to just remember these things. But SAP, anybody else using SAP besides Cargill?
What exactly is that?
SAP is a big sort of enterprise, well, you can describe it actually. You want to describe it?
It's software that the biggest organizations run to do their everything. It's very big in manufacturing, but it's very big in other things too. They call it ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. And
What is it actually written in? Is it
push
Java?
one button and money comes out the other end. Run,
Yeah, right.
the whole business kind of a thing.
Yeah.
As long as you can spend $3 billion to implement it.
Yeah. And SAP, I think, is based in Dusseldorf in Germany, but it's been really big here for, I don't know, 30 years, really. And enterprise relationship planning software, is that what it stands for, ERP?
Resource planning.
Yeah. And then you have CRM, which is customer relationship management, is sort of the flip side of that, like PeopleSoft and stuff like that. There's some bigger environments. But for keeping track of where you, in the case of Cargill, they have a lot of barges and railroad cars and grain elevators and all that sort of stuff all around the world. And just keeping track of where the assets are, it's an ideal environment for that. The financial management companies, you probably wouldn't find that they're working with that. Yeah, there are some companies in here that I actually didn't even know who they were. And there's, I hate to say it, but there's also some companies that I thought were here but aren't around anymore. Like Honeywell apparently merged with Signal. I did a previous startup company that actually we had a pilot project with Honeywell through when they existed, when they were here. But that, and then there's some smaller things in here too, like Drip is a very focused kind of company. General Mills, I have no idea what they're doing out there.
General Mills is huge. They make Cheerios.
It's what?
They make Cheerios, they make Yoplait yogurt, they make all sorts of food products.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's very diversified. I mean, you think of it as the Wheaties company, but you know, it's much more than that. And then Land O'Lakes, Medtronic actually there's pretty interesting different areas in here in medical information. There's a lot of security and HIPAA concerns about that. Is anybody actually working with HIPAA specific stuff? No. Okay, well, what about in terms of programming environments? Is anybody doing JavaScript currently, and what companies are you thinking that you're going to be working for?
Drip uses a framework called Elm.
Elm? Mm-hmm. Who's using Elm?
Drip. I know. I was interviewing somebody from there, and they were like, "We use Elm at Drip," and I was like, "Is that like React or Vue?" And they're like, "No, it's like Elm." I'm like,
Yeah.
so that's very specific. So yeah. But I agree. Like finding out what people are working in Calum-wise is helpful. I don't think it's a trade secret. I mean, like the frameworks people use to do their front ends is pretty apparent.
Yeah.
So I think that's helpful. I mean,
Have you
resource for that is helpful when you're hiring or looking for jobs. I think that's okay.
What are the, is there any kind of training course or certification you can do for that, or is it just sort of self-taught?
It's really specific, and I think they even admit internally that they picked a pretty specific.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, someone said React at Best Buy, that seems right. I mean, it feels like JavaScript is one that's pretty common.
Yeah.
And then zeroing in on like what flavor they're using, you can just look at their website.
What flavor is right? Because, you know, like JavaScript is actually like 5 different languages at least.
But I think that's helpful too, like in React and even React Native for you know, like you sort of like, you can find that very easily by looking at job postings. And as someone who's hiring a lot for my startup, I use that all the time. And it is, you spend so much time looking through like, where's a good place to kind of ask if people are getting, like Target, for instance, they have some React Native, they've got Objective-C, you know, they've got Swift, they've got everything. So the big ones are really hard, like that person was saying earlier.
Things that I didn't put on here were like, that I've been reminded of in the meantime that were important are like PHP and Java and C for that matter. Are there any, like Medtronic, they're probably doing stuff with C and C++, I would suppose, but I don't know, for, you know, embedded control devices. And that is another whole area by itself. Is anything that is like device control, you're probably going to be in a particular area. So what else did I put on here? There's some Perforce is actually here. I didn't realize that until recently. Does anybody know about Perforce? Well, if everybody's worked with Git and GitHub, Perforce is not that. They've been a really big part of the version control marketplace. And I was surprised to find out about them, that they were here, because they recently bought a bigger startup company in Portland, where I was from originally. And I didn't realize that. What's that?
How long have they been around for?
I think probably about 20 years.
Okay.
And it's probably a couple thousand people. I have no idea what their programming environment is. But yeah, and then what else did I put on here? Oh, object partners. There's a lot of real diversity in this. I heard about SkyKit right away because I belong to the Python programming group that's local here, and SkyKit's been offering to use that as a meetup space for a while, because they do strictly Python and Google Cloud related development. But yeah, so, oh, and Smart Things, I didn't know anything about that. Apparently is a Samsung division. Does anybody have any exposure to them?
Yeah, so they were acquired by Samsung probably 5 or 10 years ago.
Did you work with them, or?
No, they were a local startup.
Yeah.
A success story. So.
How do you find out about who's using what kind of environment?
I mean, job postings, like I said, or just talking to people that work there. I mean, I came up through the Ruby community, so there was a lot of people in Ruby that bounced around.
Yeah.
But JavaScript, I would say, is predominantly what anybody, whether it's Node or front end, like everybody's doing some flavor of that.
Well, yeah, that's why I say, JavaScript is really split. Is there a Node house in particular? I mean, anybody that's
Can't
known
think
as
of
being.
one. But the other thing you mentioned too is like AWS versus GCP versus Azure. That's helpful, I think, especially for machine learning stuff. What stack people are using. But I don't know intimately, like people that have been inside probably would know more intimately, like Cargill doesn't use AWS, obviously. I don't know what their mandate is there.
Yeah, there's an R group here too, speaking of Python, and I don't know if anybody's been working with Python for machine learning, but that's been like the big area for a while now, and most of the stuff is developed in Python, but R is more statistically oriented, and it was a relatively small meetup group, but actually the meetup groups are a really great way to find out about these things. It takes time, but has anybody been, any meetup groups that you've been involved in that are particularly helpful for software learning, for a programming environment?
Well, there's a Ruby Users Minnesota group. That's a pretty well-attended group.
Yeah.
RUM for short, people call that.
Oh, how do I get this to come back on? There we go. Yeah, so let's see, what else did I put on here? The financial companies, I had Thrivent is off the screen here, but Thrivent, Ameriprise, that there's some people that are using Go and Golang as well for doing bigger operating kind of stuff, and I think they're part of that. So is there a particular language focus that people really have here? Is it all JavaScript, or are there people that have been doing stuff in Java or earlier programming environments?
Well, let me just bring up, you got Angular down there. You mentioned Angular.
Yeah.
So I've done JavaScript, not professionally, big scale, but I've done it since before it was called JavaScript. It used to be called LiveScript. So I've dabbled in it, dabbled with all the different frameworks and jQuery and such. But the last 5, 6 years, everything I do is Angular. But the important thing is, there's an API, okay? So it's totally separated. Now, finally, we have this separation between what goes on the browser, and that's going to change and everything.
Yeah.
But everything you do is backed by an API, a REST API that talks JSON, and you can write the server side in whatever language you like. And we have people at our company that use all sorts of different languages. I prefer Java because that's the most stable enterprise, and it just does. And it does all of this stuff which previously would have been very tedious, mapping. Okay, so you have You have an object model that's in your JavaScript Angular. Angular actually uses something called TypeScript, which turns into JavaScript or whatever. But you create your little model objects. You know, I have a user object. What's a user object? Got a first name, last name, ID, whatever, email. And then over in the Java world, I've got that same model object, which has a first name, last name, whatever. And then it's just seamless how the binding of this just works. And so Java is a fabulous, easy to use on the server side. You would never waste your time writing a user interface in that, although I've done that numerous times in the past. But I was so relieved when Angular, and it's like, so I you know, but those are the two that I use. But again, you could write the server or anything. But the key thing is, there's an API, so it's totally distinct, and you can have different teams writing it, and you could throw away one or the other. And then the other thing for our company is, our customers may want to use that same API
Customize, yeah.
to do other things,
Yeah.
with other automated tools, for example. So that's you know, that's APIs. The authentication is always something to think about, and there are different tools and models for that. But you know, again, that separation of the presentation from the server side that's a key concept that I think people should learn, rather than just doing a whole monolithic thing.
Have you been tempted to do GraphQL at all?
No, I've seen you do that. No.
Yeah.
I've heard of multiple places trying it out, but there's a lot of security issues. So what I've heard recently, the last 5 years or so, is you can do everything underneath with GraphQL, but then the interface to the outside world is still over HTTPS. So it might be REST, or it might be something that people call REST as something else, but it's still running through a hardened web browser. Whereas like GraphQL, if you aren't careful, you can expose all kinds of inner workings.
Yeah, there's also, one of the other things that I didn't put on here is Ruby. There's companies here that are, at least some of the startups are doing Ruby on Rails. It's really been pretty big in the Chicago area. I don't really run into very many people on the West Coast that were working with it, but there's several companies that got bigger there that are doing that. Home Chef is one. The guy that, it's probably a couple thousand people at this point, and it was the founder, the CEO, actually wrote the app originally in Ruby on Rails, and it's still what they use. But the home-based people are there. ThoughtWorks. I mean, there's other companies that are really kind of closely associated with Ruby on Rails. I don't know who's working with it here, really. I ran into somebody earlier who had just taken a job at a company where he's learning that.
Sure.
So, yeah, these things, partly it's fashion, but partly it's solving a particular problem. Like, you know, your thing with the connecting the API and the back end with Angular, why change that? Some people have sort of gone through that, but yeah, this is Angular 2, presumably.
Right. Yep. So that's an important distinction. That when they say Angular JS, that was a totally different thing, and Google totally redid it. So yes, that's a 2+. They just call it Angular now, because I think they're on Angular 13 now, or 14. I don't know. I can't keep up with them.
You know, one thing that I haven't, we touched on data-related stuff a little bit, but we haven't really gotten into that at all. And I don't know if there's any shops that think of themselves as being, it's an Oracle shop, or we're doing MySQL or PostgreSQL, or whatever like that. Just SQL is SQL. But is that something that's come up for people at all in terms of the company standardized on a particular SQL data environment? Or is it not as important as programming?
At least in my experience, it's been one of the many elements of dependency help. Predominantly working in fintech, a lot of banks are married to their dependencies and very reluctant to switch for obvious reasons. If anything breaks, it's millions of dollars down the drain. So we're stuck working with like SQL versions that were deprecated and no longer supported, or just don't have a lot of functionality.
Yeah, the other thing that's sort of in that same kind of space as what cloud environment you're working with. Because AWS kind of got in there early and became a big standard for anything that's cloud connected, but it's basically just S3 and easy for EC2 for the programming environment. But Google followed pretty much the same model, and I don't know, is anybody working with Azure? Has anybody gone from AWS or GCP to Azure?
I've done the opposite. Where
The opposite?
Yeah. From mass data storage from Azure to AWS.
And where, can you talk about what environment that is?
I mean, I was mostly handling the front end, so I wouldn't be able to speak to any specifics. Really.
Yeah.
So Microsoft continues to get new technologies, and everybody's been watching Microsoft for the last, 40 or 50 years. But it's really pretty interesting right now when you bring up Azure, because when you look at the whole DevOps thing, so they have this thing called Azure Devops.
Yeah.
Which is Microsoft, and they invested this huge thing. It's been around for, I don't know, more than a decade. But they bought GitHub, so they bought the thing that is the open source, Linux,
Right.
core thing. And now that they own that now, and so now GitHub has, so now we're talking about the build environment, and we're talking about, all those things, and GitHub has their own versions of GitHub Actions and everything. And the build, so there was a big executive order which came out from the White House back in May of 2021. It's been a huge impact on my company, and it's impacting the whole software industry. But it's on improving the nation's cybersecurity, and if you haven't, you should become familiar with that if you're in application development. But one of the big things that was is the integrity of the build system. So we always think about, we write software, where everybody's really careful about the source control, making sure that two people looked at it, whatever you maintain it. Well, then there's all these other things that go into building the actual executable. And the integrity of the build process is now a big focus for security. And it was motivated by the SolarWinds hack back then. That's really what precipitated Joe Biden writing this. He wrote an excellent paper here, executive order. But that was a malware which got in during the build process, and it was very sophisticated. And now that the SolarWinds was this piece of software which was running throughout the data centers, all the data centers, and now once it was corrupted with a Trojan, it's like, whew, that was big, So so anyway, but back to Azure, and now that their Visual Studio becomes their Visual Code, whatever I guess.
VS Code, yeah.
Well, that's what all the JavaScript developers are using now, because now that's integrated with like stack splits, and it's like, wow, they're doing a lot of. It's not just the, Microsoft, you had to just get their stack and stick with it. It's pretty interesting right now.
Yeah, it's become a weird thing because on the one hand, you have like the Chris Messina in the opening keynote talk was, talking about the marvels of having lots of eyes looking at software and being part of the open source movement, et cetera. But that also has become a problem with like Docker and NPM in the node world. When you see that there's only 326 packages that are maybe risky in this particular build, you start to wonder, how can I actually go through that and modify anything? In Docker, if you're doing virtualization, it's the same kind of thing. Well, there's maybe millions of lines of code that you don't know anything about that are underneath it. So yeah, we've started to have some initiatives to try to have ways to do checking of what the origin of something is. And then the other extreme is just use an environment like Go, where you have an entire, the whole platform is all very narrowly specified, and there's only one way to get anything to work.
Well, that's the other thing, the big thing that came out of the EO is the software bill of materials. So that's a new acronym that we're going to hear a lot of in this industry if you're selling or dealing with anything with big companies or governments for sure. So they call that the SBOM and everything. But and this is this idea that we really have to know exactly what the heck all those little things are that we got from wherever, And there's lots of security vulnerabilities and everything show up. I'm in app security, so that's what my focus is. But in the executive order, well, the quote in there he states is, it's like, the software industry needs to have this exact list of everything that's in it, just like the food industry does, you know?
Yeah.
You've got Pillsbury up there, and it's like, yeah, they know how to do that, but somehow we haven't been doing that, and we will be doing that here in application development.
Yeah, that I know that was one of the big ideas for blockchain initially was, you know, IBM and other big companies would help to track the source of food. So if you got your strawberry shortcake and the strawberries were bad, you know, you could find out about that. But it's turned out to be a more difficult problem than I think they thought. And software maybe is going to be a little bit better, but we'll see. I don't know, are the companies here that are particularly concerned about security? There's nobody here from Granicus, but Granicus does government-related software and a platform for enabling government employees to talk to each other more easily. And they did a presentation earlier, and I kind of, you know, it's just one session, so there wasn't enough time to talk about, oh, alarm's going off.
We have a lot of healthcare in the city.
Yeah.
And I can assure you they're very concerned about it.
Okay.
Yeah, we do a lot of work in correctional facilities, so security is very important to us. Just Golang on the back end is pretty
Do
fun.
you guys have supply chain auditing?
What?
Supply chain auditing?
Yes, yeah, we're very vertically integrated with canteen ordering. We've experienced that before. It's anything in and out of the facility. And we also create our own surrounds for kiosks, use and source our touchscreen, et cetera, and make sure that everything going in is okay.
And so does that auditing involve like somebody firing up Wireshark and actually sniffing packets and making sure data isn't getting exfiltrated or activities?
Oh, yeah.
Like, is there
For
actual intrusion
application-wise
detection?
as well.
Yeah.
I was leaning more toward our whole physical
physically.
integration, physically, yeah. But no, yeah, applications especially, and very tight firewalls when we go into. We use our own networks there to make sure that everything coming in and out is expected to be coming in and out. It's pretty fun. We give them little handheld devices. We have program in Android and make our own things.
In Android?
Yeah.
Well, I think, yeah, we're not going to be able to do much because you know, actually this is an interesting problem, but I've been running Ubuntu for almost 20 years. And you can't connect to well, it's not the problem with Ubuntu connecting, it's the Google Drive is blocked, which is what all of this is on. So the only way that we're able to do a connection is to turn a hotspot on in here, go on 5G instead of Wi-Fi, and then provide that to the computer. But we didn't work out the stuff on how it actually fits on the screen. So it's a little bit problematic how we're going to do this for the next session because we need to do a demo. But you know, Windows is still sort of the standard thing. Is anybody, I'm kind of curious on that front, is anybody running WSL, the Windows for Linux subsystem? Yeah? Have you moved to the WSL2 stuff that's out now?
I've tried. I've hit a bunch of issues with ports and like actually getting a GUI set up, so I just transitioned back. But yeah, I've got it running on Kali Linux and Ubuntu.
Yeah, so do you use any of the, well, you end up probably running VS Code on WSL2 or on VSL?
I have run it on WSL1. I've not been able to get WSL2 running on Windows 10 just yet. Just at least playing nicely with whatever GUI open source will actually allow me to see what's going on.
Yeah. Are there programming schools that people have found to be particularly useful here in terms of, you know, I know in the Bay Area and also in Portland and Seattle, it's become kind of a big deal, and actually in Chicago too, but I haven't heard that much about them here, just being here short term, like General Assembly or that kind of thing. Has anybody gone through any of those programs?
There's a couple, like there's Prime Digital, there's General Assembly and whatnot, but there's also, there's actual companies that'll, like Work Solutions, for example, they pay people to learn how to, you have to like get into the program, but they'll pay people to learn how to code and then place them at companies asking for more developers. And that's in the cities.
Well, this particular document, such as it is, I intended to get all of the information that we could from talking about it and then make it internet accessible so people could continue to add to it maybe through the Ministar site. I don't know. It's something that would be useful for them to have. But there's another session that's sort of about the state of the tech environment in Minnesota too, and maybe that'll cover part of it. But so I'm not sure if everybody, I think if you signed up for this particular session, we have your email address from that, so I can send everybody the link to this, and we can certainly add to it in real time. I try to do that sort of thing in the Portland area as well, just to get a bigger map of who's using what technology. So I appreciate all the input, and I think that's the end of our time. I'm going to figure out how to get this to work for the next session. Thank you.